Thanks a lot, Bruce. Waiting for my timer to, actually, I'm going to jump in before the timer starts to give me a couple more minutes, but really appreciate being given the opportunity to talk with you today, specifically about some of the research going on at the university and across the country related to early onset Alzheimer's disease. Just very briefly, in terms of disclosures, nothing to report. Oh, sorry, thought I had a list of funding in there, but that is funded by Alzheimer's Association and the NIH for some of this work. And in terms of acknowledgements, not only do we want to thank participants and study partners, which without them, none of this is possible, but in particular, wanted to give a thank you to Liana Apostolova, both as her role throughout PI through the lead study, and also her contribution specifically to these slides. She's not able to make it here today. So early onset Alzheimer's disease is a relatively uncommon phenomenon. In fact, Alzheimer's is increasingly becoming more common in general, but early onset Alzheimer's disease only occurs in about 5% of cases of AD. I'm going to be using the term EOAD throughout this talk to speak about early onset Alzheimer's. And the definition of EOAD really is just someone developing Alzheimer's before the age of 65. So that would be usually between the ages of 40 and 64. We have known about early onset AD for approximately 30, 40 years. However, even to this point in 2023, there really is no uniform diagnostic criteria for the condition, and any information that we know tends to come from small sample sizes in the literature. But what we do know is that EOAD is not traditional AD, just happening a little younger. In fact, I'm going to be calling traditional AD late onset Alzheimer's disease. You may wonder, why is there no middle onset? We've got early and we've got late. But EOAD tends to have a much more aggressive and rapid disease course than traditional AD does. It's not only more rapid, but it's much more aggressive. And so for individuals, for a condition like Alzheimer's disease that we know can lead to very impacting cognitive declines later in life, the increased severity in EOAD is actually rather staggering how impactful and it is for individuals. Beyond just differences in presentation, we also see differences neuroanatomically. At least that's what the literature has suggested. And non-memory cognitive domains tend to be the most impacted, at least that's the theory for early onset Alzheimer's disease, so not the memory-driven processes we're used to seeing. And additionally, there's less involvement of some of the brain regions most commonly identified in Alzheimer's disease, like the frontoparietal changes that are most common. And so in response to some of this lack of knowledge that we have, the longitudinal early onset AD study, or LEADS study, was undertaken to really try to better understand this condition. And in the LEADS study, which was started by Liana Apostolova, we are taking 600 cognitively impaired individuals and 100 cognitively unimpaired folks between the ages of 40 and 64 across several sites in the US. And really the goal is to get an understanding of sporadic AD. So for any genetics researchers out there, this is not autosomal-dominant early onset Alzheimer's disease, but that just occurring randomly in the community. And we're going to now try to understand clinical, cognitive, fluid and imaging biomarker, and genetic characteristics of these folks. These folks are also getting not only baseline information, but we're looking at them every 12 months, hopefully for perpetuity, but at least through the first grant process, it's through the first 3 years. And as you can see on the slide, we tend to have a very large representation throughout the entirety of the United States. There's 18 lead sites in the US. It's probably a little too small to see in the right-hand corner, but we are ranging basically from UCSF in San Francisco to Mass General on the other side of the country. Essentially, if it's a big name academic medical institution, we have some connection to try to get individuals with EOAD into the cohort to better represent them. We've had a lot of success over the past 12 months getting to the point of being able to disseminate some of this information. We've actually had the great fortune of Alzheimer's and Dementia Journal picking up a special issue specifically on EOAD, and we had 11 studies published in this edition, special issue. And all of the names that are in bold off to the right, which I believe there are 7, those are IU researchers who are the first author on these. And when we're thinking about what is the purpose of LEADS, as I alluded to before, basic information is just one piece, and it's an important piece. We literally are attempting to define early onset AD, understand its phenotypic variants, so its clinical presentations, understanding the disease progression, and as Dr. Lamb alluded to early on, an additional goal is to be able to have a clinical trial ready cohort for when drugs come down the pipeline that may be beneficial for folks with early onset Alzheimer's disease. I'm going to walk through very quickly just some of the characteristics of the sample that we have. And what you can see is that we have 3 different groups in this cohort. We have folks who are cognitively normal. There's approximately 100 of those individuals. We've got the EOAD population, who is around 350, 365 at this point with recruitment. And then there's an additional group who has early onset dementia, but they do not have amyloid positivity. And amyloid positivity is required for a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. So they are, we call them EO non-AD, and I'll be making reference to them frequently throughout the talk. We tend to see actually that there's not much of a difference between our clinical groups on any of the major demographic factors like age, sex, education, or URM is essentially minority status. But we do see that the cognitively normal group, so our controls, are they tend to be a little bit younger, they tend to be more frequently female, they tend to have slightly higher education, and they tend to have a higher proportion of individuals who are racial minorities, ethnic and racial minorities. And while we look at these numbers here, the 36% is actually something that we are quite proud of here in LEADS. But while the rate of non-white, essentially, participants in the clinical groups is lower, these numbers are actually dramatically higher over the past year than they were previously. This is due to the work of a diversity supplement that we received from the Alzheimer's Association and some of the great work put in by, for example, Ange Polsinelli and Jane Muzema, as well as the OREC core of the ADRC, specifically Sophia Wang. Knowing that there are those demographic differences, we then need to, of course, incorporate that into any of our comparisons at baseline. But what we are essentially seeing is when we look at the different cognitive domains across the different diagnostic groups, we are seeing that the EOAD group is worse than the cognitively normal group across the board, which isn't really a big surprise. But additionally, even after we control for mental status, severity of disease, we are seeing that the episodic memory and executive domains are actually still more impaired compared to the other dementia group that doesn't happen to have amyloid positivity. So this early onset AD group is really pronouncedly impaired well beyond anything we're seeing in other conditions early onset. We additionally looked from a phenotypic presentation. So what is the clinical presentation of people coming in? And we're seeing that the folks tended to fall into 4 main categories, either an amnestic or a memory presentation, a posterior cortical atrophy, which is a clinical term for folks with severe vision deficits. Dr. Stark made reference to primary progressive aphasia, so a language dysfunction, and then a dysexecutive kind of we always use the term frontal related, even though we're just talking about a location of the brain, and we probably shouldn't use that phrase. But either way, when we look across the board, we're seeing that almost 80% of the population in Leeds does have an amnestic presentation, which is not what the majority of the small sample studies have suggested. We were expecting maybe a third to have an atypical non-memory presentation. So this in and of itself is very enlightening for the early onset research world. And when we took those same phenotypic presentations, the clinical presentations, and just to be sure that there's not something funky going on with them, we mapped those performances across the cognitive domain areas. And fortunately, we see that the amnestic group does have problems with episodic memory. The dysexecutive group does have problems with both speed and attention and executive skills. The visual-based posterior cortical atrophy does have visual problems, and then the primary progressive aphasia group does have language problems. And you may be thinking, this is just diagnostic circularity. You use these variables to diagnose the individuals. We actually didn't. This was purely based on clinical impression coming in, how we came up with the phenotypic representation. And so all those past few slides have actually been related to some of my work on the Leeds studies. And next I want to highlight folks from some of the other cores and some of the other areas of research related to Leeds. And so Ange Polsinelli has done some great work looking at neuropsychiatric symptoms in EOAD. And what she's found is actually not only in EOAD, but both amyloid positive and negative early dementias, they are having issues with affective disorders, distress disorders, impulse control disorders, and to some extent psychosis. But what's actually interesting is that when you specifically look between the two clinical groups, it's the non-AD group that tends to have a lot worse of a presentation. And that in and of itself is fodder for a 45-minute conversation and discussion about it, but just wanting to kind of mention that briefly as something that we are further investigating, and Ange specifically is looking into that. From a genetic standpoint, Kelly Noodleman, also here at IU, has looked at the apolipoprotein representation, the genotypy, in our population, again, amongst these three diagnostic groups. And what we're finding is that, so a little background for the audience, for those not knowing, the apolipoprotein E4 allele tends to have higher rates of individuals developing Alzheimer's disease. And what we're seeing is the EOAD group is having a much larger presentation of E4 representation than even the EO non-AD group. We're seeing this across whether they have one allele for E4 or two alleles, both alleles for E4. And then conversely, those individuals who carry an E2 allele, which is protective against Alzheimer's disease, we are seeing that those individuals have, let me see, there we go. Those individuals, they tend to be more likely to be non-amyloid related Alzheimer's disease. So they are EO non-AD. So the protective factors that keep people from developing amyloid and Alzheimer's disease, we're seeing that in this cohort. And then similarly, when we actually look then at what do we know about traditional onset Alzheimer's disease, if you happen to look at the numbers, our early onset AD group, as far as their genotypic makeup, is almost identical to what is in the posted literature among when looking through the ALS gene meta-analytic data, which is a repository of a number of different case control studies. So we are seeing exactly what we would expect to see in late onset Alzheimer's disease, which is a little bit of a surprise for us. But then we're additionally seeing that our cognitively normal folks tend to have a different presentation than most cognitively normal groups. Our group tends to have a higher rate of some of the risk factors and a lower rate of the protective factors than we would expect for just a traditional cognitively normal group, making us wonder, do we have a proper representation, properly represented group? Or is there something about this study, something about this sample that folks are willing to volunteer, even though they're cognitively intact, to be in our sample, which is going to be years of investigation trying to ensure that we understand not only our clinical groups, but our control groups. And so my last couple slides here are related to some of the research into imaging factors that actually is conducted through LEADS, but not necessarily through IU. And what we've been able to find, particularly with some of the folks working at a Mass General, is that when looking at MRI atrophy data, you can see a particular early onset AD signature. And what that is we are seeing atrophy both in the lateral temporal and lateral parietal lobes, as well as the medial lobe, medial parietal lobe. That may not mean much to the non-AD researchers, but what we typically tend to see in traditional onset Alzheimer's disease is a heavy representation of atrophy in the medial temporal and the anterior temporal lobes. So what this tells us is this is in fact presenting differently. We may be seeing similar ApoE genetic rates, but we are not seeing the exact same imaging profile as what we would expect. And when we look at this AD signature, it is then highly correlated with clinical markers suggesting there is clinical validity to this atrophy signature that we're identifying. And so lastly, just wanted to briefly mention on some amyloid and tau PET results that we've seen up to this point. As far as amyloid results, there actually is absolutely no surprise. We see that the folks who are identified as being amyloid positive AD have higher amyloid. Not a big surprise there. But in terms of tau deposition, which is one of the other key players in Alzheimer's disease, we are seeing a much higher rate of tau deposition in our early onset Alzheimer's disease group than we do for either the EO non-ADs or the cognitively normal folks. And actually one thing that's rather interesting is we've literally got 3 people hanging out up here that we are fascinated to investigate more of what exactly is going on with these folks. And that's certainly an area of future research for us. And in terms of other areas of future steps for the LEADS study, I alluded to the 18 sites in the US, but we are going globally. And we have contracted with 5 sites throughout the globe in order to specifically get a better representation of EOAD beyond the US borders. And so we're working with folks in Buenos Aires, in Barcelona, in London, in Amsterdam, and in Lund, Sweden. And we're currently in the process of just getting those folks up and started. It's very exciting. We're harmonizing our data sets as best we can with language differences so that they will be able to build onto the data that we have been collecting up to this point. So with that, I really just want to give a shout out to the research team. Without you all, this couldn't happen whatsoever. And I apologize, I've had the blinking light for the past few minutes, but decided I was gonna continue on. So with that, thank you all very much.